Joining us, Financial Times columnist and provost of King's College, Cambridge, Gillian Tett, professor of economics and public policy at the University of Michigan, Justin Wolfers, and NBC News senior business correspondent, Christine Romans. First, Christine, I want to ask you about the markets.
Yeah.
They initially reacted quite positively to this news.
Yeah, they did, because, look, it was the first real challenge to the president's trade war, a trade war that markets don't like, that business doesn't like, right? And this was a case was brought by states and also by small businesses who said, look, you don't have the authority, Mr. President, to do this, and it's too disruptive to our business. And this three-judge panel, a bipartisan panel, by the way, Reagan, Obama, and Trump-appointed judges.
3 judges.
So really important there. They said, no, you don't have the authority to do this. And Wall Street really liked that. But the reaction, I think, has sort of come back down to earth a little bit.
And why is that?
Because there still is a trade fight here. Donald Trump still really loves tariffs, and he could go ahead and use other authorities that he has successfully used for, like, steel and aluminum. He could try to put tariffs on in different ways as well. This also, there was, in a weird, twisted way, some certainty July 9th when his big pause of those so-called reciprocal tariffs was going to expire, and they said they'd have all these trade deals done by then. Well, now that's kind of up in the air as well. So there's still a lot of uncertainty, and maybe the White House doesn't have the leverage it thought it did in these trade negotiations, and so Wall Street kind of came off of its early enthusiasm.
Let's talk about the EU, Gillian. I mean, that was the next big trade deal that Donald Trump was going after. He initially set one deadline, then he moved that deadline back a bit, citing work with the European Union to actually get to a deal. What does the European Commission, the executive arm of the EU, do now that there was this court order?
Well, this timing is extraordinary because the European Union leaders have been debating in recent days whether they should act tough like the Chinese and simply basically respond to bullying with trying to, face him down, or whether they should be more like the UK and try and dance around Washington and get them more on their side and cut some kind of deal. Now that Trump's trade tariffs have been turned down by the courts, they're likely to actually either simply stall, as you say, or really stand up to him and say no. Now, the danger of all this is that Trump has, as we know, a pretty fragile ego. He tends to respond to losses by doubling down and being even more aggressive. The fact that people are calling him Taco, Trump always chickens out, which was one of the acronyms one of my colleagues at the Financial Times first started writing about, has really got under his skin. Donald Trump, of course, likes to call other people names, not have people call him names. And so there is a danger now that he simply lashes out, that he invokes other types of trade laws to try and impose his plan, or that he simply ignores the courts at some point. We just don't know. So there is a lot more uncertainty. But certainly for the European Union right now, there is a very strong incentive to stall and to keep stalling.
I wish, now that you're talking about Taco, I wish that I had the forethought to screen grab the front of the Drudge Report right now. It's an AI-generated image of Donald Trump wearing a king of tacos, wearing a taco suit and a taco crown. Worth taking a look at, obviously trying to taunt him. Justin, let me ask you about the normal rules of the game here. Part of the reason this trade commission or this trade court said Donald Trump doesn't have this authority is because normally the authority to levy tariffs, not in a time of an emergency, is within Congress. I think it's notable that it's the courts that have to assert Congress's authority. Congress itself, other than a few lawmakers, have not done so.
Right. So the president is not born with the right to do this. Congress gave it to him. And so the first best thing would be if we had a grown-up Congress who took their role seriously. Instead, this has been the most passive Congress I can ever remember. In fact, as far as I can tell, they've done nothing about anything so far, but they certainly haven't held back the king. So what Trump has done is very aggressively tried to take powers that would normally belong to Congress, and the courts have smacked him down. Katie, I just got notice, apparently an hour ago, a D.C. District Court also ruled on the same set of issues, issuing another preliminary injunction. So we've now had 2 federal courts within 24 hours rule that this use of the emergency powers is illegal. And to be clear, it's utterly obvious. The so-called emergency was that we had imbalanced trade. It turns out every country around the world has imbalanced trade. It turns out the United States has had it in every single year of its existence. So the idea that all of a sudden it was a national emergency in 2025, but no other year, sort of seems absurd on its face.
But I do understand if you want to make the argument that there are national security concerns and there are some things we do need to manufacture here. We've got to get control over some of our critical supply chains, technology supply chains, steel supply chains, whatever, because that's important for our national security. I get that, Justin. But if you want to do that and you want to argue that, is this the way you go about it?
No.
Is there a way to go about it?
Yeah, there's a very clear distinction here that's worth bearing in mind. So what Trump was doing was trying to beat up on whole countries. China's a bad guy. The United Kingdom's a bad guy. Europe's a bad guy. Even the herd in McDonald Islands were bad penguins. That's what was ruled illegal. Now, it turns out there's a lot of other trade authorities, including specific authorities around national security, that the president can, has, and does use. For instance, there are currently tariffs on steel and aluminum, I believe is how Americans say it.
No, not aluminium. Aluminum, you got it right.
Okay, great. Aluminium. Those tariffs are still in place because they're a national security concern, and they went through a process of making the case, the sort of process Congress laid down in order to make that case. So we're going to move from these country-specific tariffs instead to looking at specific industries, which I think is at the very least going to lead the president to be a little bit more precise in what he's doing. Having said that, there are some authorities still where he can go and clobber whole countries. There's one where he's allowed to, and I wouldn't be surprised if he did it this week. He can levy tariffs of up to 15% on countries for up to 150 days. After that, he'd have to go back to Congress, which he's not been very fond of doing.
Let me play Caroline Leavitt at the White House today, echoing what we've heard from this administration about individual or groups of judges.
Last night, the Trump administration faced another example of judicial overreach. Three judges of the U.S. Court of International Trade disagreed and brazenly abused their judicial power to usurp the authority of President Trump to stop him from carrying out the mandate that the American people gave him. The courts should have no role here. There is a troubling and dangerous trend of unelected judges inserting themselves into the presidential decision-making process.
It seems like they want this battle, Christine. They want to push the courts. They want to force the Supreme Court to get involved in these cases. I'm sure there are people within the administration who understand what authorities the president has and what authorities he does not have. I know that they probably have gone through the various rules that he could levy tariffs on. I'm sure I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt. I think they know this. But I also think these individual fights that they know are going to get held up in courts are fights that they want to have because they want to go to the Supreme Court, the same Supreme Court that gave him sweeping unilateral authority just a few years ago with the presidential immunity case.
You've already heard them, the allies of the president today is calling this a globalist, pro-trade, pro-importer kind of.
That's not what they're ruling. They're ruling this is just not your authority.
They're ruling on the law. And I'll go back again. This is a bipartisan, really nerdy, trade-focused court with a Reagan, Obama, and Trump appointee there. These are not DNC lawyers here that they're fighting against. It is a third co-equal branch of government.
I do want to get back to taco because I think it's worth lingering on
the
that.
The taco trade?
Yeah, because the president, Jillian, you mentioned this. The president doesn't like this, doesn't like this idea. He was asked about it yesterday, and I think we should play how he responded.
Mr. President, Wall Street analysts have coined a new term called the taco trade. They're saying Trump always chickens out on your tariff threats, and that's why markets are higher this week. What's your response to that?
I kick out?
Chicken out.
Oh, isn't that nice? Chicken out. I've never heard that. You mean because I reduced China from 145% that I set down to 100 and then down to another number? And I said you have to open up your whole country. And because I gave the European Union a 50% tax tariff. We had a dead country. We had a country people didn't think it was going to survive, and you ask a nasty question like that. It's called negotiation.
Christine just pointed out he misspoke and said tax right there. Instead of calling it a tariff, he called it a tax, which is what it is. The administration has tried to deny that. But, Jillian, let's go back to the core there. By the way, I was able to get that image from the Drudge Report. The Taco King, here it is, the AI image of it. He doesn't like being mocked. And this is not a reporter mocking him. It's not a reporter asking a question that she thinks is going to get at him. I mean, this is what's happening with traders. This is what traders are saying about Donald Trump. This is how they are making money off of Donald Trump.
Yeah, there's 2 points to make. Firstly, as we know, bullies like to appear completely impregnable and domineering and in control until they're suddenly not. And they can't afford to look as if they're weak because then they lose their power. Secondly, he's used to giving the names to other people and throwing out taunts attacking others. Remember Crooked Hillary or Little Mark Rubio, things like that. So the idea that Wall Street has basically turned the same game back against him is pretty threatening. And you can see that from the way he's stumbling. There's another acronym going around, which Anthony Scaramucci coined, TACE, if you like. Trump always confuses everyone. And that's another way of describing what's going on right now. But I think there's a lot of diplomats around the world and a lot of CEOs and, frankly, Trump opponents who will be noticing what's happened around the whole tag in the last few hours, trying to learn some lessons. And we may well see a repeat of this going forward.